Chapter 7. And so it stood, a warm and vivid patch in his life, casting a radiance that glowed in 1,000 recollections. Twilight at Mrs. Wickett's, when the school bell clanged for call-over, brought them back to him in a cloud. Catherine scampering along the stone corridors, laughing beside him at some howler in an essay he was marking, taking the cello part in a Mozart trio for the school concert, her creamy arm sweeping over the brown sheen of the instrument. She had been a good player and a fine musician. And Catherine furred and muffed for the December house matches, Catherine at the garden park that followed speech day prize-giving, Catherine tendering her advice in any little problem that arose. Good advice, too, which he did not always take, but which always influenced him. "Chips, dear, I'd let them off if I were you. After all, it's nothing very serious. I know, I'd like to let them off. But if I do, I'm afraid they'll do it again. Try telling them that, frankly, and give them the chance. I might. And there were other things occasionally that were serious. You know, Chips, having all these hundreds of boys cooped up here is really an unnatural arrangement when you come to think about it. So that when anything does occur that oughtn't to, don't you think it's a bit unfair to come down on them as if it were their own fault for being here? Don't know about that, Kathy, but I do know that for everybody's sake we have to be pretty strict about this sort of thing. One black sheep can contaminate others, after he himself has been contaminated to begin with. After all, that's probably what did happen, isn't it? Maybe. We can't help it. Anyhow, I believe Brookfield is better than a lot of other schools. All the more reason to keep it so. But this boy, Chips, you're going to sack him? The head probably will when I tell him. And you're going to tell the head? It's a duty, I'm afraid. Couldn't you think about it a bit, talk to the boy again, find out how it began? After all, apart from this business, isn't he a rather nice boy? Oh, he's all right. Then, Chips, dear, don't you think that there ought to be some other way? And so on. And about once in 10 times he was adamant and wouldn't be persuaded. In about half of these exceptional cases he afterwards rather wished he had taken her advice. And years later, whenever he had trouble with the boy, he was always at the mercy of a softening wave of reminiscence. The boy would stand there, waiting to be told his punishment, and would see if he were observant, the brown eyes twinkle into a shine that told him all was well. But he did not guess that at such moments Chips was remembering something that had happened long before he was born. That Chips was thinking, young ruffian, I'm hanged if I can think of any reason to let him off, but I'll bet she would have done. But she had not always pleaded for leniency. On rather rare occasions she urged severity where Chips was inclined to be forgiving. I don't like this type, Chips. He's too cocksure of himself. If he's looking for trouble, I should certainly let him have it. What a host of little incidents, all deep buried in the past. Problems that had once been urgent, arguments that had once been keen, anecdotes that were funny only because one remembered the fun. Did any emotion really matter when the last trace of it had vanished from human memory? And if that were so, what a crowd of emotions clung to him as to their last home before annihilation. He must be kind to them, must treasure them in his mind before their long sleep. That affair of Archer's resignation, for instance, a queer business that was. And that affair about the rat that Dunster put in the organ loft while old Ogilvy was taking choir practice. Ogilvy was dead, and Dunster drowned at Jutland. Of others who had witnessed or heard of the incident, probably most had forgotten. And it had been like that with other incidents for centuries. He had a sudden vision of thousands and thousands of boys from the age of Elizabeth onward, dynasty upon dynasty of masters, long epics of Brookfield history that had left not even a ghostly record. Who knew why the old fifth-form room was called the Pit? There was probably a reason to begin with, but it had since been lost like the lost books of Livy. And what happened at Brookfield when Cromwell fought at Naseby nearby? How did Brookfield react to the great scare of the 45? Was there a whole holiday when news came of Waterloo? And so on up to the earliest time that he himself could remember, 1870. And Weatherby saying by way of small talk after their first and only interview, "Looks as if we shall have to settle with the Prussians ourselves one of these fine days, eh?" When Chips remembered things like this, he often felt that he would write them down and make a book of them. And during his years at Mrs. Wickett's, he sometimes went even so far as to make desultory notes in an exercise book. But he was soon brought up against difficulties, the chief one being that writing tired him, both mentally and physically. Somehow, too, his recollections lost much of their flavor when they were written down. That story about Rushton and the sack of potatoes, for instance. It would seem quite tame in print, but Lord, how funny it had been at the time. It was funny, too, to remember it. Though perhaps if you didn't remember Rushton, and who would anyway after all those years? It was such a long time ago. Mrs. Wickett, did you ever know a fellow named Rushton? Before your time, I dare say. Went to Burma on some government job, or was it Borneo? Very funny fellow, Rushton. And there he was dreaming again before the fire, dreaming of times and incidents in which he alone could take secret interest. funny and sad, comic and tragic. They all mixed up in his mind, and someday, however hard it proved, he would sort them out and make a book of them. Chapter 8. And there was always in his mind that spring day in '98 when he had paced through Brookfield Village as if in some horrifying nightmare, half struggling to escape into an outside world where the sun still shone and where everything had happened differently. Young Faulkner had met him there in the lane outside the school. "Please, sir, may I have the afternoon off? My people are coming up." "Hey, what's that?" "Oh, yes. Can I miss chapel too, sir?" Yes. "And may I go to the station to meet them?" He nearly answered, "You can go to blazes for all I care. My wife is dead and my child is dead, and I wish I were dead myself." Actually, he nodded and stumbled on. He did not want to talk to anybody or to receive condolences. He wanted to get used to things, if he could, before facing the kind words of others. He took his fourth form as usual after call-over, setting them grammar to learn by heart while he himself stayed at his desk in a cold, continuing trance. Suddenly someone said, "Please, sir, there are a lot of letters for you." So there were. He had been leaning his elbow on them. They were all addressed to him by name. He tore them open one after the other, but each contained nothing but a blank sheet of paper. He thought in a distant way that it was rather peculiar, but he made no comment. The incident gave hardly an impact upon his vastly greater preoccupations. Not till days afterward did he realize that it had been a piece of April foolery. They had died on the same day, the mother and the child just born, on April 1st, 1898. Chapter 9. Chips changed his more commodious apartments and schoolhouse for his old original bachelor quarters. He thought at first he would give up his housemastership, but the head persuaded him otherwise. And later he was glad. The work gave him something to do, filled up an emptiness in his mind and heart. He was different. Everyone noticed it. Just as marriage had added something, so did bereavement. After the first stupor of grief, he became suddenly the kind of man whom boys at any rate unhesitatingly classed as old. It was not that he was less active. He could still knock up a half-century on the cricket field. Nor was it that he had lost any interest or keenness in his work. Actually, too, his hair had been graying for years. Yet now, for the first time, people seemed to notice it. He was 50. Once, after some energetic fives, during which he had played as well as many a fellow half his age, he overheard a boy saying, "Not half bad for an old chap like him." Chips, when he was over 80, used to recount that incident with many chuckles. Old at 50, eh? It was Naylor who said that, and Naylor can't be far short of 50 himself by now. I wonder if he still thinks that 50's such an age. Last I heard of him, he was lawyering, and lawyers live long. Look at Halsbury, Chancellor at 82, and died at 99. There's an age for you. Too old at 50. Why, fellows like that are too young at 50. I was myself a mere infant, and there was a sense in which it was true. For with the new century there settled upon Chips a mellowness that gathered all his developing mannerisms and his oft-repeated jokes into a single harmony. No longer did he have those slight and occasional disciplinary troubles or feel diffident about his own work and worth. He found that his pride in Brookfield reflected back, giving him cause for pride in himself and his position. It was a service that gave him freedom to be supremely and completely himself. He had won, by seniority and ripeness, an uncharted no-man's land of privilege. He had acquired a right to those gentle eccentricities that so often attack schoolmasters and parsons. He wore his gown till it was almost too tattered to hold together. And when he stood on the wooden bench by the big hall steps to take call over, it was with an air of mystic abandonment to ritual. He held the school list, a long sheet curling over a board, and each boy as he passed spoke his own name for Chips to verify and then tick off on the list. That verifying glance was an easy and favorite subject of mimicry throughout the school. Steel-rimmed spectacles slipping down the nose, eyebrows lifted, one a little higher than the other, a gaze half-rapt, half-quizzical. And on windy days, the gown and white hair and school list fluttering in uproarious confusion. The whole thing became a comic turn sandwiched between afternoon games and the return to classes. Some of those names and little snatches of a chorus recurred to him ever afterward without any effort of memory. Ainsworth, Atwood, Avonmore, Babcock, Babbs, Barnard, Bassenthwaite, Battersby, Beckles, Bedford Marshall, Bentley, Best. Another one, Unsley, Vales, Wadham, Wagstaff, Wallington, Waters Primus, Waters Secundus, Watling, Waveney, Webb. And yet another that comprised, as he used to tell his fourth-form Latinists, an excellent example of a hexameter. Lancaster, Latin, Lamar, Leighton Bosworth, McGonigal, Mansfield. Where had they all gone to, he often pondered. Those threads he had once held together, how far had they scattered, some to break, others to weave into unknown patterns? The strange randomness of the world beguiled him, that randomness which never would, so long as the world lasted, give meaning to those choruses again. And behind Brookfield, as one may glimpse a mountain behind another mountain when the mist clears, he saw the world of change and conflict. And he saw it more than he realized with the remembered eyes of Kathy. She had not been able to bequeath him all her mind, still less the brilliance of it, but she had left him with a calmness and a poise that accorded well with his own inward emotions. It was typical of him that he did not share the general jingo bitterness against the Boers. Not that he was pro-Boer, he was far too traditional for that, and he disliked the kind of people who were pro-Boers. But still it did cross his mind at times that the Boers were engaged in a struggle that had a curious similarity to those of certain English history book heroes. Hereward the Wake, for instance, or Caractacus. He once tried to shock his fifth form by suggesting this, but they only thought it was one of his little jokes. However heretical he might be about the Boers, he was orthodox about Mr. Lloyd George and the famous budget. He did not care for either of them. And 1 year later, Algie came as the guest of honor to a Brookfield speech day. Chip said on being presented to him, "Mr. Lloyd George, I am nearly old enough to remember you as a young man, and I confess that you seem to me to have improved a great deal." The head standing with them was rather aghast. But Algie laughed heartily and talked to Chips more than to anyone else during the ceremonial that followed. Just like Chips was commented afterwards, "He gets away with it. I suppose at that age anything you say to anybody is all right." Chapter 10. In 1900, old Meldrum, who had succeeded Weatherby as head and had held office for 3 decades, died suddenly from pneumonia, and in the interval before the appointment of his successor, Chips became acting head of Brookfield. There was just the faintest chance that the governors might make the appointment a permanent one. But Chips was not really disappointed when they brought in a youngster of 37, glittering with firsts and blues, and with the kind of personality that could reduce Big Hall to silence by the mere lifting of an eyebrow. Chips was not in the running with that kind of person. He never had been and never would be, and he knew it. He was an altogether milder and less ferocious animal. Those years before his retirement in 1913 were studded with sharply remembered pictures. A May morning, the clang of the school bell at an unaccustomed time, everyone summoned to assemble in Big Hall. Ralston the new head, very pontifical and aware of himself, fixing the multitude with a cold, presaging severity. "You will all be deeply grieved to hear that His Majesty King Edward VII died this morning. There will be no school this afternoon, but a service will be held in the chapel at 4:30. A summer morning on the railway line near Brookfield. The railwaymen were on strike, soldiers were driving the engines, stones had been thrown at trains. Brookfield boys were patrolling the line, thinking the whole business great fun. Chips, who was in charge, stood a little way off, talking to a man at the gate of a cottage. Young Cricklade approached. "Please, sir, what shall we do if we meet any strikers? Would you like to meet one?" I don't know, sir." God bless the boy. He talked of them as if they were queer animals out of a zoo. "Well, here you are then. You can meet Mr. Jones. He's a striker. When he's on duty, he has charge of the signal box at the station. You've put your life in his hands many a time." Afterward, the story went round the school. There was Chips talking to a striker. Talking to a striker. Might have been quite friendly the way they were talking together. Chips, thinking it over a good many times, always added to himself that Kathy would have approved, and would have also been amused. Because always, whatever happened and however avenues of politics twisted and curved, he had faith in England, in English flesh and blood, and in Brookfield as a place whose ultimate worth depended on whether she fitted herself into the English scene with dignity and without disproportion. He had been left a vision that grew clearer with each year, of an England for which days of ease were nearly over, of a nation steering into channels where a hair's breadth of error might be catastrophic. He remembered the Diamond Jubilee. There had been a whole holiday at Brookfield, and he had taken Kathy to London to see the procession. That old and legendary lady, sitting in her carriage like some crumbling wooden doll, had symbolized impressively so many things that, like herself, were nearing an end. Was it only the century, or was it an epoch? And then that frenzied Edwardian decade, like an electric lamp that goes brighter and whiter just before it burns itself out. Strikes and lockouts, champagne suppers and unemployed marchers, Chinese labor, tariff reform, HMS Dreadnought, Marconi, Home Rule for Ireland, Dr. Crippen, suffragettes, the lines of Chotulja. An April evening, windy and rainy. The fourth form construing Virgil, not very intelligently, for there was exciting news in the papers. Young Grayson in particular was careless and preoccupied, a quiet, nervous boy. Grayson, stay behind after the rest. Then, Grayson, I don't want to be severe because you were generally pretty good in your work, but today you don't seem to have been trying at all. Is anything the matter? No, sir. Well, we'll say no more about it, but I shall expect better things next time. Next morning it was noised around the school that Grayson's father had sailed on the Titanic, and that no news yet had come through as to his fate. Grayson was excused lessons. For a whole day the school centered emotionally upon his anxieties. Then came news that his father had been among those rescued. Chip shook hands with the boy. Well, I'm delighted, Grayson. A happy ending. You must be feeling pretty pleased with life. Yes, sir. A quiet, nervous boy. It was Grayson Sr., not Jr., with whom Chips was destined later to condole. Chapter 11. And then the row with Ralston. Funny thing, Chips had never liked him. He was efficient, ruthless, ambitious, but not somehow very likable. He had admittedly raised the status of Brookfield as a school, and for the first time in memory there was a longish waiting list. Ralston was a live wire, a fine power transmitter, but you had to beware of him. Chips had never bothered to beware of him. He was not attracted by the man, but he served him willingly enough and quite loyally. Or rather, he served Brookfield. He knew that Ralston did not like him either, but that didn't seem to matter. He felt himself sufficiently protected by age and seniority from the fate of other masters whom Ralston had failed to like. Then suddenly, in 1908, when he had just turned 60, came Ralston's urbane ultimatum. Mr. Chipping, have you ever thought you would like to retire? Chip stared about him in that book-lined study, startled by the question. Wondering why Ralston should have asked it, he said at length, No, I can't say that I've much thought about it yet. Well, Mr. Chipping, the suggestion is there for you to consider. The governors would, of course, agree to your being adequately pensioned. Abruptly, Chips flamed up. But, I don't want to retire. I don't need to consider it. Nevertheless, I suggest that you do. But, I don't see why I should. In that case, things are going to be very difficult. Difficult? Why difficult? And then they set to, Ralston getting cooler and harder, Chips getting warmer and more passionate, till at last Ralston said icily, Since you force me to use plain words, Mr. Chipping, you shall have them. For some time past, you haven't been pulling your weight here. Your methods of teaching are slack and old-fashioned. Your personal habits are slovenly. And you ignore my instructions in a way which in a younger man I should regard as rank insubordination. It won't do, Mr. Chipping, and you must ascribe it to my forbearance that I have put up with it so long. But, Chips began in sheer bewilderment, and then he took up isolated words out of that extraordinary indictment. Slovenly? You said? Yes, look at the gown you're wearing. I happen to know that that gown of yours is a subject of continual amusement throughout the school. Chips knew it too, but it had never seemed to him a very regrettable matter. He went on, And you also said something about insubordination? No, I didn't. I said that in a younger man I should have regarded it as that. In your case, it's probably a mixture of slackness and obstinacy. This question of Latin pronunciation, for instance. I think I told you years ago that I wanted the new style used throughout the school. The other masters obeyed me. You preferred to stick to your old methods, and the result is simply chaos and inefficiency. At last, Chips had something tangible that he could tackle. Oh, that, he answered scornfully. Well, I admit that I don't agree with the new pronunciation. I never did. A lot of nonsense in my opinion. Making boys say Kikero at school. For the rest of their lives they'll say Cicero, if they ever, say it at all. And instead of vicissum, God bless my soul, you'd make 'em say we kiss him. And he chuckled momentarily, forgetting that he was in Ralston's study and not in his own friendly form room. Well, there you are, Mr. Chipping. That's just an example of what I complain of. You hold one opinion and I hold another, and since you decline to give way, there can't very well be an alternative. I aim to make Brookfield a thoroughly up-to-date school. I am a science man myself, but for all that I have no objection to the classics, provided that they are taught efficiently. Because they are dead languages is no reason why they should be dealt with in a dead educational technique. I understand, Mr. Chipping, that your Latin and Greek lessons are exactly the same as they were when I began here 10 years ago. Chips answered slowly and with pride. For that matter, they are the same as when your predecessor, Mr. Meldrum, came here. And that was 35 years ago. We began here, Mr. Meldrum and I, in 1870, and it was Mr. Meldrum's predecessor, Mr. Weatherby, who first approved my syllabus. You'll take the Cicero for the fourth, he said to me. Cicero too, not Cicero. Very interesting, Mr. Chipping. But once again it proves my point. You live too much in the past and not enough in the present and future. Times are changing, whether you realize it or not. Modern parents are beginning to demand something more for their 3-year school fees than a few scraps of languages that nobody speaks. Besides, your boys don't learn even what they're supposed to learn. None of them last year got through the lower certificate. And suddenly, in a torrent of thoughts too pressing to be put into words, Chips made answer to himself. These examinations and certificates are so-and-so. What did they matter? And all this efficiency and up-to-dateness, what did that matter either? Ralston was trying to run Brookfield like a factory for turning out a snob culture based on money and machines. The old gentlemanly traditions of family and broad acres were changing as doubtless they were bound to. But instead of widening them to form a genuine inclusive democracy of Duke and Dustman, Ralston was narrowing them upon the single issue of a fat banking account. There never had been so many rich men's sons at Brookfield. The speech day garden party was like Ascot. Ralston met these wealthy fellows in London clubs and persuaded them that Brookfield was the coming school. And since they couldn't buy their way into Eton or Harrow, they greedily swallowed the bait. Awful fellows, some of them. Though others were decent enough. Financiers, company promoters, pill manufacturers. One of them gave his son £5 a week pocket money. Vulgar, ostentatious. All the hectic rotten ripeness of the age. And once Chips had gotten into trouble about some joke he had made about the name and ancestry of a boy named Isaacstein. The boy wrote home about it, and Isaacstein père sent an angry letter to Ralston. Touchy, no sense of humor, no sense of proportion. That was the matter with them, these new fellows. No sense of proportion. And it was a sense of proportion above all things that Brookfield ought to teach. Not so much Latin or Greek or chemistry or mechanics. And you couldn't expect to test that sense of proportion by setting papers and granting certificates. All this flashed through his mind in a moment of protest and indignation. But he did not say a word of it. He merely gathered his tattered gown together and with an oomph walked a few paces away. He had had enough of the argument. At the door he turned and said, "I don't intend to resign, and you can do what you like about it." Looking back upon that scene in the calm perspective of a quarter of a century, Chips could find it in his heart to feel a little sorry for Ralston, particularly when, as it happened, Ralston had been in such complete ignorance of the forces he was dealing with. So, for that matter, had Chips himself. Neither had correctly estimated the toughness of Brookfield tradition, and its readiness to defend itself and its defenders. For it had so chanced that a small boy waiting to see Ralston that morning had been listening outside the door during the whole of the interview. He had been thrilled by it naturally and had told his friends. Some of these in a surprisingly short time had told their parents, so that very soon it was common knowledge that Ralston had insulted Chips and had demanded his resignation. The amazing result was a spontaneous outburst of sympathy and partisanship such as Chips in his wildest dreams had never envisaged. He found rather to his astonishment that Ralston was thoroughly unpopular. He was feared and respected, but not liked. And in this issue of Chips, the dislike rose to a point where it conquered fear and demolished even respect. There was talk of having some kind of public riot in the school if Ralston succeeded in banishing Chips. The masters, many of them young men who had agreed that Chips was hopelessly old-fashioned, rallied round him nevertheless because they hated Ralston's slave driving and saw in the old veteran a likely champion. And one day the chairman of the governors, Sir John Rivers, visited Brookfield, ignored Ralston, and went directly to Chips. A fine old fellow, Rivers, Chips would say, telling the story to Mrs. Wickett for the dozenth time. A very brilliant boy in class. I remember he could never master his verbs. And now, I see in the papers, they've made him a baronet. It just shows you. Sir John had said on that morning in 1908, taking Chips by the arms as they walked round the deserted cricket pitches. "Chips, old boy, I hear you've been having a deuce of a row with Ralston. Sorry to hear about it for your sake. But I want you to know that the governors are with you to a man. We don't like the fellow a great deal. Very clever and all that, but a bit too clever if you ask me. Claims to have doubled the school's endowment funds by some monkeying on the stock exchange. Dare say he has, but a chap like that wants watching. So if he starts chucking his weight about with you, tell him very politely he can go to the devil. The governors don't want you to resign. Brookfield wouldn't be the same without you, and they know it. We all know it. You can stay here till you're 100 if you like it. Indeed, it's our hope that you will." And at that, both then and often when he recounted it afterward, Chips broke down. Chapter 12. So he stayed on at Brookfield, having as little to do with Ralston as possible. And in 1911, Ralston left to better himself. He was offered the headship of one of the greater public schools. His successor was a man named Chatteris, whom Chips liked. He was even younger than Ralston had been, 34. He was supposed to be very brilliant. At any rate, he was modern. Natural sciences tripos. Friendly and sympathetic. Recognizing in Chips a Brookfield institution, he courteously and wisely accepted the situation. In 1913, Chips had bronchitis and was off duty for nearly the whole of the winter term. It was that which made him decide to resign that summer when he was 65. After all, it was a good, ripe age, and Ralston's straight words had in some ways had an effect. He felt that it would not be fair to hang on if he could not decently do his job. Besides, he would not sever himself completely. He would take rooms across the road with the excellent Mrs. Wickett, who had once been linen room maid. He could visit the school whenever he wanted and could still, in a sense, remain a part of it. At that final end-of-term dinner in July 1913, Chips received his farewell presentation and made his speech. It was not a very long speech, but it had a good many jokes in it and was made twice as long perhaps by the laughter that impeded its progress. There were several Latin quotations in it as well as a reference to the captain of the school, who, Chips said, had been guilty of exaggeration in speaking of Chips's service to Brookfield. But then, he comes of an exaggerating family. I remember once having to thrash his father for it. Laughter. I gave him 1 mark for a Latin translation, and he exaggerated the 1 into a 7. Roars of laughter and tumultuous cheers. A typical Chips remark, everyone thought. And then he mentioned that he had been at Brookfield for 42 years, and that he had been very happy there. It has been my life, he said simply. O miei praetoritos referatsi jubera annos. I need not, of course, translate. Much laughter. I remember lots of changes at Brookfield. I remember the first bicycle. I remember when there was no gas or electric light, and we used to have a member of the domestic staff called a lamp boy. He did nothing else but clean and trim the lamp lights throughout the school. I remember when there was a hard frost that lasted for 7 weeks in the winter term. There were no games, and the whole school learned to skate on the fens. 1880-something that was. I remember when 2/3 of the school went down with German measles, and Big Hall was turned into a hospital ward. I remember the great bonfire we had on Mafeking night. It was lit too near the pavilion, and we had to send for the fire brigade to put it out, and the firemen were having their own celebrations, and most of them were, in a regrettable condition. Laughter. I remember Mrs. Brule, whose photograph is still in the tuck shop. She served there until an uncle in Australia left her a lot of money. In fact, I remember so much that I often think I ought to write a book. Now what should I call it? Memories of Rotten Lines, eh? Cheers and laughter. That was a good one, people thought. One of Chips's best. Well, perhaps I shall write it someday. But I'd rather tell you about it, really. I remember, but chiefly I remember all your faces. I never forget them. I have thousands of faces in my mind. The faces of boys. If you come and see me again in years to come, as I hope you all will, I shall try to remember those older faces of yours, but it's just possible I shan't be able to. And then someday you'll see me somewheres and I shan't recognize you, and you'll say to yourself, the old boy doesn't remember me. Laughter. But I do remember you, as you are now. That's the point. In my mind, you never grow up at all. Never. Sometimes, for instance, when people talk to me about our respected chairman of the governors, I think to myself, ah yes, a jolly little chap with fair hair that sticks up on top, and absolutely no idea whatever about the difference between a gerund and a gerundive. Loud laughter. Well, I mustn't go on, all night. Think of me sometimes as I shall certainly think of you. Haikoli meminise jovabit. Again, I need not translate. Much laughter and shouting and prolonged cheers. August 1913. Chips went for a cure to Wiesbaden, where he lodged at the home of the German master at Brookfield, Herr Stiefel, with whom he had become friendly. Stiefel was 30 years his junior, but the 2 men got on excellently. In September, when term began, Chips returned and took up residence at Mrs. Wickett's. He felt a great deal stronger and fitter after his holiday, and almost wished he had not retired. Nevertheless, he found plenty to do. He had all the new boys to tea. He watched all the important matches on the Brookfield ground. Once a term, he dined with the head and once also with the masters. He took on the preparation and editing of the new Brookfieldian directory. He accepted presidency of the Old Boys Club and went to dinners in London. He wrote occasional articles full of jokes and Latin quotations for the Brookfield Terminal magazine. He read his Times every morning, very thoroughly, and he also began to read detective stories. He had been keen on them ever since the first thrills of Sherlock. Yes, he was quite busy and quite happy too. A year later, in 1914, he again attended the end-of-term dinner. There was a lot of war talk, civil war in Ulster and trouble between Austria and Serbia. Herr Stiefel, who was leaving for Germany the next day, told Chips he thought the Balkan business wouldn't come to anything.